to our webinar on Reaching Through the Screen. I'm Tony Carlton and I'm the Director of Corporate and Professional Education at Macquarie Business School. Communicating successfully is difficult enough in the physical world. As we move increasingly towards a virtual world, communication especially has another barrier between us, literally. Today, Duncan Young is going to provide guidance about how we can best communicate in this virtual environment. Duncan has been working as a leadership consultant for the past 20 years. He's helped hundreds of organisations and individuals learn how to better communicate, connect and collaborate. He is qualified in a number of psychometric testing tools and leadership development techniques. For Macquarie Business School, Duncan teaches a very popular short course called Communicating with Presence and Impact. It is highly experiential and brings a lot of real-world applications and helps people to better understand how to operate and communicate in a dynamic environment. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and will be made available to participants on completion. I would also encourage you to use the chat function during the webinar, as there will be time at the end to answer questions raised by you. I would also encourage you to minimise your gallery speaker, which should be on the top right hand of the screen. I would now like to hand over to Duncan.
A very good morning and welcome. Thanks so much, Tony, for the introduction, and to the entire Macquarie Business School team for inviting me to be part of this webinar series. It's a delight to be here. So today I'm going to be sharing with you some of my top tips for communicating with greater impact in this virtual environment that we're all operating within now, and I dare say will continue to operate within for some time to come yet. I certainly hope that by the end of this session, you've got some really practical tools and strategies that you can apply immediately, whatever the context, whether that's delivering an important message within a presentation, whether that's having more effective team meetings, or indeed whether you're trying to just improve the quality of your one-on-one conversations. And I'm very aware that for many people, you know, they're coming into what we call performance review season. So I think the ability to really connect and share our most important messages and exchange important information is really vital, and this is a critical skill to consider. So what we're going to be doing is dividing the session into three parts. I'm going to start off by considering what are some of the current challenges in this current context and within this environment. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that we've observed through our work as being somewhat of an obstacle or a barrier to being able to communicate effectively within this context. Some of this is also drawn from our insight and research, which we've conducted with a number of clients. From there, I'm really going to talk about this idea of reaching through the screen, and what do we mean by that? I will just say that my 15-year-old gave me some feedback on the name of the webinar. She said, "Dad, it sounds like a horror movie." So, you know, we'll see how we go. Hopefully that's not an omen for how the next half hour goes. But reaching through the screen is really about how do we establish a sense of presence in this environment? How do we put ourselves forward with as much clarity so that we can have the impact that we're wanting to have? And more importantly, how do we make sure that we're present for our audience, whether that's a group of people or whether that's an individual that we're trying to connect with? So how do we have presence, and how do we establish that connection as a function of that? So from there, we're going to start to look at some of the top tips for how to do that most successfully. And there are kind of two parts to that. First of all, I'm going to share with you some tips regarding communicating with impact that is universally relevant. So whatever the situation you're in, whatever the environment that you're operating in, so even if it's a face-to-face environment, I think these things are really important to bear in mind and consider when you're needing to have that degree of impact. We're also going to look at a number of specific tips and takeaways for how you do that most effectively in this virtual environment. So that's what we've got ahead of us, and I think we should jump straight into it. So first of all, let me take you through these. Now I will say these challenges that I'm going to share with you, which should be coming up on the screen right about now, So these are the top 6 that we've gleaned through our own observations, and as I say, through the research that we've been doing. You may indeed have some other experiences. You may have experienced other obstacles to communicating and connecting in this environment. And if you have, then we're really encouraging of you using the chat function within Zoom today. So please, if you've got additional insights, things that would add value to the rest of the participants or attendees on this course, then please add that into the chat function. Also, please record your questions as we go through this, because we'll be coming to your questions towards the latter part of the session, and those are really important for us to get a sense of what's important for you moving forward. All right, so in no particular order, here's what we've identified as some of the challenges. Now, first of all, ad hoc conversations, or should I say the lack thereof. Now, when we're in physical proximity, when we're in the workplace together, and I'm sure many of you will know this and have experienced this, whether we're bumping into somebody in the lift or wandering down the corridor or in the kitchenette, wherever it might be, the workplace affords opportunities for these spontaneous ad hoc conversations. And oftentimes, this is when work really gets done. This is when we, because we're not focused on it so much, we're having an easy, natural conversation. And sometimes that's when we come up with our best ideas. That's when we realize that there's, a solution to the problem that's been plaguing us for weeks, or perhaps when we realize, we understand who's the right person to speak to regarding the project that we're currently involved in. So I know that lots of organisations have gone to great lengths to try and replicate opportunities for these ad hoc conversations as we're operating in this virtual environment. But nevertheless, and I think some of those have been quite successful from what I understand. But, there's nothing quite like being in that physical proximity to allow for those ad hoc conversations. So that's the first one. The second one is the relative lack of non-verbal information. So as human beings, and I'll talk about this in a bit more depth and detail as we're looking at some of the tips and strategies. So as human beings, we rely very heavily on non-verbal information to extract meaning from what we're saying to one another. So whether that's the tone of voice or the facial expression, the posture, the way somebody is oriented towards us or away from us physically, all of these things help us make meaning of what we're saying to one another. And for many people, they're experiencing a difficulty in connecting because there is less access to those non-verbals. Now, in saying that, I think that there are many ways of overcoming that. And in fact, I think to some degree, you can, depending on how you use the environment and use the technology, I think we can maximize non-verbal communication in a way that perhaps many people aren't able to at the moment. So moving forward from this, and I think there's a relationship between this one and the previous point. So some people are reporting that there is a challenge in having the most important conversations, and sometimes the most important conversations are the most challenging conversations. And we know that it's a hallmark of a high-performing team, the ability to lean into that discomfort, to be able to give the feedback that we need to give, to be able to challenge each other's ideas and thinking. This is really important for achieving great outcomes. And when we're in this virtual environment and we have this barrier, as Tony alluded to just a little earlier on, it can feel much more challenging to display the kind of vulnerability and forthrightness that's required to have these challenging conversations. Again, I think there are ways of overcoming this, and we'll look at those in due course. Across the bottom, we've got some challenges that I'm sure will be entirely familiar to everybody. So we know that staring into a screen all day is fatiguing, is tiring. So that's a reality that we're all facing into right now. I think a big part of what's creating the Zoom fatigue, or whatever platform you're using, insert that title, fatigue. I think it's been caused by the fact that we're all in a state and a stage of learning how to utilize this technology most effectively. And what I mean by that is when we're learning something new, the our cognitive powers are being drained in a way that's perhaps more intense than if we're just operating in a very familiar environment. So I dare say, I think we'll all get better over time as we get used to the environment, as we get used to navigating all the tools and so on and so forth. So hopefully that one will ease up. Technical glitches, we've all experienced these, I'm sure. Internet dropping out, sound not working. I think people not taking themselves off mute, etc., etc. And you know, the thing is, it always tends to be the point that's most important in the conversation when we have a technical glitch. Do you know, I think the one most important thing I want to say to you all in this webinar is, so I hope you got that, right? So you see what I did there, a little bad joke maybe, but it is inevitably those moments when we're really trying to connect with somebody that there tends to be a bit of a glitch. So what we can do about that, who knows, maybe, you know, call your local provider and see if you can work out a stronger or more secure internet connection. Now, the final one we have there is we've got our little friend Fido down in the bottom corner of the slide there. This is certainly one that I experience, you know, the domestic distraction. So whether that's your barking dog or, you know, a child, hopefully we're all out of the woods on that one, the homeschooling challenge. Nobody's having kids run in the middle of your meetings, maybe not to the degree that was happening a couple of weeks ago. But nevertheless, when we're working from home, there is the potential for lots of distractions. So again, these are some simple things, but worth recognizing as being somewhat of a challenge to communicating with maximum impact in this environment. All right, so just coming out of that, we're certainly going to look at some strategies for overcoming those obstacles. But now I would really want to talk about this idea of reaching through the screen and this idea of presence. And presence has kind of two connotations by and large. There's one interpretation of that word, which is fundamentally about a quality of charisma. And certainly, you know, in my experience, you know, way back when, I don't work as an actor anymore, but certainly when I did, you know, you'd come across lots of people who had this quality of presence and charisma. And, you know, and it's a hard thing to think about. How do I replicate that? If indeed I feel like I don't have that quality of presence, how do I achieve it? Because what is it? It's kind of like an indefinable quality that some people seem to have and other people just seem not to have. So if you don't have it, how do you get it? I'm not too sure about that one. But there's another meaning of presence that I think is entirely available to all of us. And that's the definition of presence, which is about being in the moment. And I want to share with you a story that I think kind of captures both sides of the equation in terms of those different meanings. And this story, you know, I'm going way back in time here. And when I was working as an actor, I got a job on a large Hollywood film that was being filmed in Australia, in Sydney, out at Fox Studios, as it should so happen. And it was one of the Star Wars films. So if there are any Star Wars aficionados or fans, well, you know, get excited. So at that time, I had a particular role on set, which required me to be there every day. So I saw a lot of famous people come and go, and, you know, I'm just as prone to getting starstruck as anybody else. So, you know, I'd see all of these famous people. Oh, wow, isn't that amazing? And a lot of them had this kind of quality of charisma and presence in that sense of the word. But I noticed that the crew, the Australian crew, the camera team and the lighting team, and, you know, all of those sub teams within a film production unit, they were fairly blasé about all of these people coming and going. They'd seen it all before, and until one person came on set, and this one person drew everybody's attention. All eyes got averted as this person walked on set. Now, in case you're wondering, it was the great American actor, Samuel L. Jackson. And I was certainly pretty starstruck because I'm a big fan of Sam Jackson's. So he was somebody who just seemed to have this charisma, this presence. And I was thinking, wow, what is it? The interesting thing is that I actually got to work with him. I did a couple of scenes with him, and certainly in my experience, was that he was an incredibly humble, really easygoing, really lovely person. And in no way, shape or form, I came to the conclusion, was he trying to command attention or demand attention. So he didn't have that presence that was sort of trying to be the, you know, the loudest person in the room or take up the most space. Sometimes I think people mistake presence for those sorts of actions and behaviours. I've observed people over many, many years. 20 years I've been doing this, and you know, part of the job is to be, I think, is to be observant and to notice what people who are really good in any domain, what are they actually doing? And the conclusion that I've come to around this idea of presence is that people with true presence aren't trying to command attention, certainly aren't trying to demand attention or take up space. People with true presence are in the moment, so present in the temporal sense. They're more likely to be focused on the external environment than on themselves. So they're more likely to be focused on their message. What am I trying to get across to whom am I trying to get it across? So focused on the message, focused on the audience, and focused on what they're trying to achieve. So it's a very external orientation that we're talking about when I'm talking about this idea of presence. When that shifts around and starts to become more self-focused, then we get more self-conscious. And I think that self-consciousness is the natural enemy to presence. So a lot of this is about, and the tips that I'm about to take you through are really about how do we get that focus onto others and onto our message so that we can really find the best way of communicating and connecting. All right, so with that in mind and that definition established, I'm going to take you through some of these top tips as we've gleaned them. So let me just go to, all right, the top 10, here we go. So as I've just mentioned again, these first 5 are the ones that are quite universal. So regardless of context and environment, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's virtual or what have you, I think these first 5 are applicable no matter what. And we go into, of course, a lot more detail around some of these themes in the workshops that we run, etc. So I'm going to touch on them fairly lightly. But these are the principles that I've selected that I think, whilst universally applicable and, you know, worth bearing in mind, also most important to consider in a virtual communication context. So the first one is about preparation. So I'm sure everyone's heard the old saying, you know, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. So this is in that vein. And I'll just come back to full screen here to talk about this in a little bit more detail. So this is about how we go about planning for the delivery of an important message. Now, a lot of the time we notice that when people know they have an important message to deliver, they get very fixated on the message itself, the what, if you like. So it's all about, what do I know? What do I think is important? What am I trying to get across? And maybe then they start to you know, fold that into the means and mode of delivery. So like, what's the information I've got to get across? And, you know, how do I build that into a PowerPoint slide deck, for example? Now, those things are important. You've got to think about the structure and the message that you're trying to get across. So thinking about a core message, thinking about your different delivery modes and platforms, etc. Really important. But I don't think you can answer the questions of what and how effectively if you haven't first considered the why and the who. So what I've noticed about people who have this you know, really strong quality of presence, they speak with a sense of intrinsic purpose. It comes from somewhere. There's conviction, there's energy. They've connected how they're feeling to what they're saying. So there's a sense of passion that comes through very often. And that's about really clarifying why is this message important to me? What do I think and feel about it that I want to express? And then the second part of that is thinking about what's the outcome I'm trying to achieve. So when you have a very clear outcome, then the message will start to coalesce around that very naturally. And of course, for your audience, it will be much more compelling and engaging. So your why has 2 dimensions to it. What's your motivation for delivering the message? And what's your objective in delivering the message? What's the outcome you're seeking to achieve? Now, from there, it's also critically important to think about the who, your audience, whether that's a whole group of people, you know, maybe a couple of hundred people on a webinar, or indeed, you know, a group of stakeholders sitting around a boardroom table. It's worth thinking about what are their filters? How do they process information? What's going on for them? What are their pressure points and priorities, their perspectives? Now, as I say, I won't go into too much more detail on that, but I will let you know that in the links that we will provide to you after this webinar, there are some videos that I've made, and there is a video called The 6 Factors of Stakeholder Engagement. So you'd be very welcome to go and have a look at that. It's on my website, and that will take you into some more detail around how to analyze and prepare a message relative to the audience that you're engaging with. All right, so that's the why, the who, the what, the how. You know, this is also important not only for the preparation, but also for the delivery. You think about the importance of the why in a team meeting. And I wonder how many of you have ever sat through a team meeting wondering, why are we here? Why am I here? And what are we trying to get out of this? So meetings often suffer, whatever the environment, from a lack of clarity of purpose and structure and process. So thinking about that and being mindful of that and articulating that in a team meeting context is always really important. All right, so just going back now, our second point is meaning is 90% non-verbal. Now, I've touched upon this already, so I won't spend too much time on this. I think as far as presence is concerned, this is about recognizing that not only is the way are you reading other people's nonverbals, but of course they're reading your nonverbals. So if you do want to establish a sense of presence, then thinking about your posture is important. For example, thinking about your facial expression, your eye contact, your use of gesture and energy. So these things matter in terms of how you come across and how you generate a sense of impact. Managing nerves is also a question, particularly when you're in a high stakes environment. I was certainly doing a lot of deep breathing into the diaphragm before this session began. You know, I don't mind saying that at all, because different situations carry a different weight, and how you show up in that environment is often about how you manage yourself, how you manage your own physiology. So, you know, think about that diaphragmatic breathing, getting yourself nice and centered, thinking about your purpose, and away you go. All right, less is more. So I'll try not to say too much about this. Nobody, or rarely does anybody ever walk out of a business presentation or a meeting complaining that it was not long enough. You know, plenty of times we wish it was shorter. So fulfill the hopes of your audience and think about less is more. So less time, less words, more concise, etc. Energy is infectious. So we are human beings, and we feed off of each other's energy. So it's really important to think about what energy am I bringing, and how is that gaining or adding weight to the message that I'm trying to get across. So people will pick up on it. One of the things we notice is that often when people are speaking into technology or into a lens, shall I say, whether that's a TV camera, a video camera, or indeed the little lens at the top of my laptop that I'm looking into right now. Often people underestimate the energy that is required. And in fact, they go the other way, they de-energize, because I think on some level, there's an assumption that the technology will do the work for me. The microphone, the camera, that will do the work. Now, that's a false assumption, because energy, all you will be projecting is that lack of energy. So my little tip is, if you are engaging an important conversation or message without dominating or becoming overbearing or anything like that, it's just worth thinking about dialing up your energy so that you really do project into and through the screen. So let's have a look at our final point on these 5 universal principles. And the last one here, let me just go back there. Listening is more persuasive than talking, and embrace golden silence. I'm very aware of the irony of the fact that I am just doing all the talking right now. But this comes back to understanding, in part, this comes back to understanding your audience and doing the appropriate level of analysis on your audience. Because if you are talking to a group of people who don't agree with the proposal or the idea that you're expressing, continuing to talk at them becomes, starts to lose you ground. It's inherently unpersuasive. So thinking about how do I need to engage in the conversation? How do I open dialogue with the group so that we can share ideas, so that we can learn from each other? Because that's the stuff of real conversation and real dialogue. It's based as much, if not more, on listening than it is on talking. Part of that is also asking the right questions and really unlocking different perspectives so that you can build a narrative and a dialogue from there. So just bear that in mind. It's not all about how we talk, it's about how we listen. Okay, so let's have a look at, now, you can't see that, so let me just go back. I'm just flying the technology here, folks, so just bear with me. Okay, there we go. So location, location, location. So this has a couple of ideas embedded within it. Presence and our ability to be presence is about our, the comfort that we feel within the environment within which we're operating. So my tip to you is, if you have an important conversation to engage in or an important message to deliver, then find yourself a location that is conducive to the delivery, to the exchange. So, perhaps not in a public place if you are working from home, maybe not in the kitchen where you might be overheard, where you might become self-conscious about the way you're expressing yourself. So think about location in that sense. How does it feed into and foster a sense of ease and comfort for you? The second part of location is that I'll touch on. There are many parts to it. The second one I want to touch on is lighting, and making sure that you're in a place where you are well lit. So if you can be lit from the front, that's beneficial. If you're lit from the back, and we see so often people position themselves with a window behind them, the nature of the technology that we're working with and the auto exposure of the camera lens, by and large, will mean that the background will blow out and become very bright, and you will go into shadow. And this is about presence, reaching through the screen. So you want to be visible to your audience. You want them to be able to see you, to be able to read your facial expression, to be able to see what it is that you're doing. And that's about being generous towards and for your audience. All right, so next we have, look out behind you. So anyone that's ever been to a pantomime will know that kind of moment where the hero is wandering across the stage and the villain is behind them. Look out behind you. So always good to be mindful of what's in your background. I'm just going to say this. I think there's a Murphy's Law thing about putting yourself in front of a door. So it doesn't matter even if you know there's no one in the house. Even if you lock that door, Murphy's Law tells me that someone is bound to walk through it. And we've all seen the YouTube videos. The chances are that it's somebody that maybe isn't wearing what they should be wearing will walk through that door. So just be mindful of doors. The other one is virtual backgrounds. So they can be fun, but use them sparingly and judiciously. It may not be the best look to turn up to a important meeting in your full Tom Cruise mode. You might be fulfilling a fantasy that you've had for a long time, but maybe not the most professional look when you're needing to get a message across. So there you go. The other thing about location that I think that I'm just going back one that I just also want to touch upon, and this came up the other day in a conversation, so I wanted to include it. I thought it was a really important point. But I think it's important to be mindful of the fact that while some of us are still at home, many people are going back to the office. And so there is a process of calibration, I think, of what's expected and what's the new normal around how we present ourselves to one another. So if we've got somebody in the office and maybe perhaps they're a little bit more formally attired, for example, and you show up in your PJs or your tracksuit, and we've seen plenty of this in the work that we've done, it might create somewhat of a disruption in terms of the rapport and the connection that we're creating with each other. So that was just one more additional point on location. So just jump back in there. All right, so going back to the slide, find your frame. And I will jump back out of this just to give a bit of a demonstration here. This one is one that I think it's, fairly simple, but time and time again in the work that we've been conducting, we see people, for want of a better description, get it wrong. So in terms of presence, it's really important to think about how you present yourself to the camera lens, how you present yourself within the frame that you're operating in. And I'll use an analogy here that from the world of filmmaking. If I'm a director of a film and I'm shooting a couple of different characters and I want to give a sense of their relative status or power, for example, there are many techniques that I might employ, but one is to change the way I'm framing both characters. So typically, if I wanted to diminish the status of a character as I'm filming them, then I would do what I'm just doing now, and I would drop that person down in the frame and give them more head height. So you can see straight away that there's a sense that I've just kind of become a bit diminished. And the person who I wanted to increase their level of power or authority, I might film up at them. So I'll go back to my Star Wars reference. For anyone who remembers, how did they always film Darth Vader? Always from below. So looking up, that projects that sense of greater authority. Now, I'm not saying that we should all come across as Darth Vader. I'm far from it. The way to think about framing is to get yourself as much as you can in the center of frame. Really keep it really simple. A way of judging that is by just measuring, is my chin right in the center of frame? Because I can put up my, if my fingernail feels like it's about in the center, it's about right. I haven't got too much head height, but I'm not cutting myself off. So about here feels about right. Now, I'm also want to get my eyes on a parallel plane with the camera lens. So I'm looking as much as possible straight across at the camera lens. Consider the alternative. If I've got my laptop down on the desk, nobody wants to be looking up anybody else's nose. So please spare people that the pleasure of looking too far up at you. And similarly, I was running a role play as part of an assessment center just the other day, and I was the person receiving some feedback in the role play. It was really interesting. The person talking to me had their laptop quite low and was looking down at me, and it really affected the dynamic of the conversation. It really felt like I was being spoken down to. So that's where the non-verbals are still playing out. So eye line, in line, nice and center in the frame. All right, let's have a look at the next one. A couple more to go. I will jump out of this one again in just a moment to do a little bit of a demonstration. Eye contact is not eye contact. I hope hopefully that's suitably intriguing. So consider this. In the classic Zoom setup, we've got our Brady, what I call our Brady Bunch configuration. So let's say we've got 9 people, 3 across and 3 down. Now, if I'm let's say I'm Carol Brady up in the top corner, and I'm wanting to have a conversation with Bobby, who's down in the bottom right-hand corner. Naturally and quite automatically, if I want to address Bobby directly, I'm going to look at where Bobby is on the screen. And this is important. I'm trying to connect with Bobby. We want to have an important conversation. So I need to make eye contact. So I look at him. Now you can see straight away there that I have just broken eye contact with all of you. In my mind, I think I'm looking at the person, but as they receive it, I'm looking away. I might even appear to Bobby that I'm starting to type an email, or I've got entirely distracted in some way, shape or form. So there's a real challenge here, and there's a bit of a trick to it in maintaining eye contact with the lens, because that will feel for your audience that you are more present for them, and therefore you're much more likely to have the impact that you're wanting to have. Now, of course, at the same time, we want to be able to get a sense of what they're saying back to us. What messages are they delivering through their non-verbal communication? So a little trick, and it's a simple one, is to manipulate the window of your Zoom or whatever platform you're using, and just see if you can move their image around and get it to a point where it sits just under the camera lens. I've found that to be pretty effective, because it will allow you the opportunity just to kind of check in with what they're doing and saying to you non-verbally. Are they looking concerned or distracted? Are they, so much of the time when we're talking, other people are giving us really important information in return, that we need to be sensitive to and adaptive to. So bring the frame up nice and close to the lens so that you can be kind of doing two things simultaneously, looking at them and also looking at the lens, which is kind of looking at them. All right, so we have one more point, and it's a simple one, and that is about reading the room. This is probably another universal principle around, and it alludes to what I was just talking about in terms of being sensitive to what other people are saying to you. I think how we read the room in the Zoom environment is something that we can probably all focus on a little bit more. One of the things I've noticed, we've been running lots and lots of virtual workshops, and by and large, they go really, really well. I think it's a fabulous platform to engage in learning. And one of the things I've noticed is often we will be facilitating a conversation and we'll ask people who are visible on screen to share something with us, or I might ask an open question to the whole group. And just subtle things like you see people's shoulders move as they think about taking themselves off mute. You see people push back and lean in. So be attentive and observant of the subtleties of again, of body language and of expression that is telling you what's going on for the other people. Because that's what presence is all about, being present in the here and now and being present to the communication, the information, the exchange that you're having with your audience or with your counterpart. So folks, there we have it, the top 10 tips. Again, I hope those provide you with some really practical strategies. Everyone to hopefully go away and reconfigure their computers, get them, in line with your eye line, get yourself a nice light that you can come across with the appropriate brightness to your audience, etc. So remember, presence is all about our connection with our audience or with our counterpart, and just doing everything that you possibly can to allow access to you and to the information that you're providing. So folks, that concludes the formal part of the presentation. And now we're going to go to some questions, which I think I'm going to hand over to Suzanne to moderate the questions that may have been coming through the chat function.
Thanks, Duncan. Appreciate that. So we've got our first question from Kim, and that is, how do you make sure that everyone in a virtual meeting is adhering to the same principles of communication?
That's a great question, Kim, and because I think, obviously we're talking about all that we can do to create a sense of presence and reach through the screen. I think it comes back to that agreement on process. And as much as you can ahead of time, letting people know the value of adhering to the same sorts of principles. And really that's just about maximizing the opportunity for us all to be able to connect and relate to one another in the most impactful and effective manner. And if you can establish that agreement and you can establish that sense of benefit to doing so ahead of time, then I think that goes a long way to ensuring that people will kind of play by the same rules, if you like.
Great. There's some great tips there on setting parameters in meetings I'll be sure to look to for myself. So we have another question from Aranita, and that question is, what emotional behavioural cues should you pay attention to in a virtual meeting that may not be as apparent compared to, say, a face-to-face situation?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Thanks, Aranita. So look, again, I think, human beings are human beings no matter the context. And so by and large, the cues that you will be getting in the virtual environment will be very similar to that which you will be getting in the face-to-face environment. But again, it comes to our ability to be able to read those signals. So, and I think a greater degree of a focus and attention on some of the subtleties of those cues is what's required. Because when we're in a physical proximity, those things, because of our ability to pick things up in our peripheral vision and sense some of the more subtle physical movements that people might make, we pick those things up more easily. We don't always respond to them in the most appropriate way, but we see them, we sense them. So I think it's about really putting an additional level of focus and attention. One of the things that obviously people have the capacity to do in the virtual environment is take themselves out of play, quite literally, by switching their video off or their mute, putting themselves on mute. We've all experienced that, I'm sure. And so it's easy to overread what that might mean. So sometimes particularly when we're in a high stakes conversation or dealing with important issues, if somebody takes themselves out of the meeting by switching their video off, our assumption is often that, I don't know, they've been offended, they've disengaged, whatever it might be. And it's often not that. It's somebody wants to grab a drink of water or what have you. So I think that while it's important to read those signals, it's also important not to make huge leaps in assuming what's going on, because we tend to assume the worst when we get that sort of response delivered back to us.
Thanks, Duncan. I think there's a related question here, which is from Alison. How can you best engage introverts in a virtual team meeting?
Look, I think this platform and virtual meetings are a great space for introverts. And what I mean by that is it allows people to, particularly using the functionality of the chat function. So it allows people to contribute their thoughts and ideas in a way that doesn't perhaps put the pressure on them to speak those thoughts out loud. So I think utilizing that functionality is really important. There are also universal principles around letting people know ahead of time what's the purpose of the meeting, what are we trying to get out of that, what are the ideas we would like you to come pre-prepared with, or the solutions to the problems that we're trying to resolve. So letting people know those sorts of agenda items ahead of time, particularly for introverts who possibly like a little bit more time to process before they start speaking into a space or an environment, is important, regardless of it being virtual or face-to-face. But yeah, I think the chat function has been something that I think I've experienced as being a real value add to some of the meetings and workshops we've been running, because it allows people to contribute as you're going.
Okay, and we have a last question here that we've got time for today, which is from Helen. Duncan, you have to tell us, who were you in Star Wars?
Well, I was many people in Star Wars. I'll keep this one quick because I know we're almost at time. So I had a role where I was read in all of, so there was lots of CGI characters, all the computer generated characters. And the actors, the real actors in the cast, requested that an actor come in and read in all of those parts, because I think in the previous films that it had been some assistant director or something like that. So I came in, and so when I did those scenes with Samuel L. Jackson, I was playing Yoda. So then I was really low, sitting down on a little box, speaking in reverse, doing my best Yoda impersonation. So yeah, that was my role on Star Wars. One for the train spotters.
And that's all we've got time for today for questions. Back to you.
No worries. Thank you so much. Look, that's it from me. Lovely to stay in touch. There's going to be links provided to you with some additional resources. So yeah, and of course we look forward to your feedback. But for now, I'm going to hand back to Tony to close out the session. So over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Duncan. Our follow-up email will include, as Duncan said, our follow-up email will include links to the resources that will help you develop your communication skills. We also offer a short course in communication with presence and impact. In conclusion, I would like to thank everyone for attending today and participating on the chat room, and I would also like to thank Duncan for his insights. Keep your eye out for future webinars and short courses. Otherwise, I hope that you get opportunities to apply the tips from today's webinar. Thank you.